Let's talk politics with Dr. Bill Rosenberg. He is professor of political science at Drexel University, author of, among other things, News Verdicts, the Debates, and Presidential Campaigns. He is tweeting at Dr. B. Rosenberg and joins us now. Bill Rosenberg, welcome back. Thanks for being here today.
Good morning.
Trust you had a great weekend?
Very nice. Always nice to have a holiday weekend with friends and family.
Absolutely. It's time to sort of decompress a little. We heard a little politics over the weekend. Of course, now we're back into it with Congress being here. And interesting that Al Franken, the senator from Minnesota who is accused of sexual harassment, has said he will abide by whatever ethics investigation says he wants to move forward. But a lot of people have been sort of putting that in the context of what they thought was his 2020 aspiration, that is to run for president. And I don't know, what is it too early to start talking about 2020, both for Democrats and even for President Trump to be thinking about running for re-election?
Absolutely not. The day that the president gets elected, the next day starts the next presidential cycle. We already have candidates that are traveling around the country trying to operate in what is sometimes called the invisible primary, where you're trying to raise money and you're trying to solicit people to work on your campaigns, who's going to be a media specialist, who's going to be your pollster, and so forth, working with state and local officials to try and galvanize sort of who's going to stand with you when it gets time to really move on that ground game in each of the states. So we're already on our way. In terms of Trump, I think Trump has an actually interesting dilemma because Trump originally, when he got elected, talked about 8 years in the White House. He's had a few stumbles as he's been president, and we all know that Donald Trump does not like to lose. So perhaps an option for him is simply not to run so he doesn't have to worry about losing.
Ivana Trump, his ex-wife, said that she's thinking he's not enjoying himself. And when you see some of the negatives and in a way, maybe his treatment of the Time Magazine Person of the Year story is a template. That is that he's sort of saying, well, if I'm not going to be the Time Magazine Person of the Year, I'm just going to talk about how they asked me to do something and I'm not going to do it. So don't believe that whoever the Person of the Year is, it was going to be me, except I wouldn't sit for the photo shoot in advance of that. And to that point you were making is maybe he just won't do it because he doesn't want to lose the election if it comes to that in 2020.
I think that's one of his biggest fears, is to be considered a loser. And an election provides the opportunity for winning and losing. There's actually a numbers count. Whether you use the Electoral College or you use the popular vote, both of those are measurable items. Whether or not you succeeded successfully in running the country is a different story, because there's going to be people with different perspectives. But elections, that's a hard number, and that will basically show whether or not he won or lost.
Mm-hmm. And we'll have to see results. I mentioned the book about George H.W. Bush. We remember he had like 90% approval rating after the invasion of Iraq, and look what happened to him in 1992. He wasn't able to get reelected.
Right. Well, that happens to several presidents. They usually start out at a high mark, and as their term goes on, they tend to fall, and they tend to fall considerably. And the real measure is whether or not they're able to recover and come back. And that's sort of the open question with Donald Trump.
Bill, I have a question. This has to do with impeachment and Tom Steyer. For those who don't know, Tom Steyer is a very wealthy man. He appeared on CNN yesterday to talk about impeaching the president. Here's a little bit of what he had to say.
It's clear that he has violated the Constitution in the sense that he has violated his trust with the American people through obstructing justice by firing the head of the FBI, Mr. Comey, for what he said explicitly was over the Russian investigation.
I have a question about this, in that Tom Steyer is spending a lot of money, some say 10, some say $20 million in his effort to get the president impeached. A lot of that money is being spent on CNN, and I guess it's not unusual necessarily to give voice to people who are speaking out, and even those who spend money. On the other hand, I wonder if that is the same as like the Koch brothers talking about something with President Trump, President Obama. And is this kind of a partisan approach to what is and should be? It'll always be a partisan impeachment, but it's one of those things we'd like to think goes far beyond just R versus D.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the things we have to recognize is that campaigns for any political issue have to start someplace. And Steyer has taken on this as a challenge that he really wants to raise that President Trump should be impeached. He's contributed significant amounts of money. I think he's also happy to get other people to contribute as well. The question about where it gets covered, well, we have this all the time. If you watch CNN and you watch Fox and you watch MSNBC and you watch CBS and all the others, while there's a heavy degree of overlap between all of them, they also do take different tacks in terms of what issues they decide to cover and what issues they don't. It's not at all surprising that Fox News would not be covering the story about impeachment on Donald Trump because they don't want that story to be sort of dominating the news coverage. More likely to be on a station like CNN or MSNBC. So there are editorial decisions about what gets on. I don't know that, I think it's kind of a cynical view to assume that CNN is putting him on the air because he's taking out ad space. But there is certainly an audience at CNN that's more interested in whether or not Donald Trump should be impeached or not. So it may be audience-driven, not just, financially driven.
I just always, having worked in news departments, always had issues when my general manager or sales manager would come in and say, hey, you need to cover this guy. He's a good client and he's opening a special thing today. And I'm like, well, what does that have to do with news? Well, it has to do with the fact.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not saying that that's the situation with Tom Steyer. But on the other hand, I would even think twice about putting him on just because of this. And it's a legitimate story. You have a man who's worth billions of dollars who's spending a lot of money trying to get the president removed. On the other hand, I would think twice about it if he's spending a lot of money, and he's not spending any money, or at least Fox is not taking his money anymore. They actually said they refused the commercials because it alienates the audience. And that's another issue, too, is because it seems to me that when you put him on your news programs and you run the ads, you run the risk of being considered to be in his court. You know what I'm saying? I mean, even with the critical questions, it's a challenge for a news organization to be able to cover something if you are going to both take money from an individual and to give that individual news time.
I would also say that there's a difference between the media in terms of how this plays out. I would think that it would be particularly problematic, we've seen historically with newspapers, because newspapers are so heavily dependent upon advertising dollars. So, for example, if you had a major newspaper that existed in a city and they were going to be doing some type of expose about bad work conditions or bad business practices, and it was against a company that was doing major advertising in their own newspaper, that would also be sort of problematic. The difference here is that in the electronic media, we have so many competing outlets. We have different audiences, which are not the same as what we had traditionally with newspapers. There's a multiplicity of different interests being played out. And while I'm not defending against the argument of sort of support for someone who has a similar like-minded idea or is taking out ad space, I think it perhaps is different depending upon the media source.
Yeah, and they do also have cable subscription fees that they get as part of it, so they're not so dependent on the advertising revenue specifically. Right. Hey, before we wrap up, Bill, I got to ask you about Alabama. Of course, this election now, the special election 2 weeks and a day from today, as you and I speak, Republicans now seemingly are in the position of either saying, in the case of the president even, it's better to have somebody who's accused child molester than it is to have a Democrat in office. And, there are Republicans who are pushing back, Lindsey Graham, for example, saying, look, you got to think about the long-term interests of the party to have this guy in there. And I also wonder if it's kind of hard to defend President Trump against the allegations made against him by saying the voters spoke, and then after the election in Alabama to say, well, the voters in Alabama spoke, but they don't count, so we're going to take this guy out. So where do Republicans go on this? Where does the president go on this?
Well, you also had Thune yesterday who was making a similar argument, third person in the Senate, third person down in the leadership, that by winning you may not actually win. So I think what we have to recognize is that a lot of this is tied to cultural wars and political dynamics. I mean, if you take a look in Alabama has not had a Democratic senator since 1987 when Hull House basically left office. In the last election in which Jeff Sessions ran, he ran unopposed. He got 98% of the vote in Alabama. So the likelihood of a Republican winning in Alabama is very high. And for people in Alabama, unlike maybe perhaps other parts of the country, they don't make the comparison the same way. I mean, they use the terms, well, I would rather have a pedophile than a baby killer. I'm not saying that that is correct in terms of the argument, but that's what happens, that you see different dynamics playing out in terms of how voters see elections, and some of it is sort of the local political culture. Some of it is the long-standing sort of normal vote of Democrats versus Republicans, which makes this very problematic. For the Republican establishment, this is kind of a nightmare. They don't really want to have the Moore campaign winning, because if he wins, it's just going to prolong the sort of the agony on the political landscape for Republicans. On the other hand, right now they really want to get their tax reform bill passed. They want to have other bills passed. They want a Republican in there desperately, because the balance of power between Democrats and Republicans is razor thin. So there's a lot going on besides the appropriateness of the candidates themselves.
Bill Rosenberg, thank you for being with us today. We'll talk to you again soon.
All right. Take care. Have a good day.
Dr. Bill Rosenberg, professor of political science at Drexel University, joining us to talk a little politics here, which is what he teaches. He is tweeting at Dr. B. Rosenberg, B-E-R-G for Rosenberg.